I hit the statue at 3:47 a.m. The sledgehammer connected with a sound that was less like triumph and more like the closing of a heavy, exhausted door. Stones spattered dust into the cold air. A little shower of concrete kissed my face. I had pictured noise, breaking as liberation. But what I felt in the instant after the blow was a great animal emptiness, as if I had cracked something that had nothing inside me to give back. They call me a lot of things now. Heiress, heretic, villain. News footage labels me with neat, terrible words that make the story simple. Rich girl destroys town relic. But the truth that refuses to sit in tidy headlines is not a photo anyone can take. It is quiet and stubborn, and it follows me into rooms where light should not go. I wasn't trying to hurt them only. I was trying to silence a part of myself I didn't know how to name. The pedestal had been wet from last night's rain. My boots left prints in the mud as I stood in the shadow of the square. The statue, bronze, weathered, Jesus with an arm extended, occupied the circle like a patient old thing. I remember thinking that if I struck it hard enough, maybe the rumble would set something loose in me. Maybe noise could become proof that something inside me was changing. Maybe smashing someone else's symbol would mean I could stop feeling pricked by the small humiliations that had accumulated in my chest for years. I swung again. The head toppled, skittered, and history, for a blink, felt like rubble. There was a man at the edge of the square who would change everything just by deciding not to call the police. He was the caretaker of the small chapel behind the square, an older man who had worked at the church for decades, his hands knuckled and stained from tending the grounds. People would later call him the old custodian in interviews. His name is Ben Alvarez. When he saw me crouched over the cracked bronze, forehead sweating, the hammer balanced like a confession in my lap, he did not shout or reach for his phone. He folded his hands, closed his eyes, and prayed. I didn't know he saw me. I thought I was alone until the video, one of the many that would later be edited into the endless feeds, showed him silhouetted against the chapel doors, lips moving slowly like a lullaby. In those first moments, I thought of him as a witness who might testify against me. That image of him gently praying grew into a fear that he would stand in a courtroom and say my name with the accusation already wrapped in it. Instead, what he did that night settled into the town like a question. What do we do when we are hurt by a symbol so many people hold dear? By dawn, there were phones everywhere. Someone's dash cam caught my running shadow. A neighbor uploaded a shaky clip. A feed went viral. The mayor sent out a statement. People came in flurries. Camera crews, teenagers with torches, older women sobbing into their scarves. I had expected fury. I had expected righteous applause from the small circle that had been feeding my anger for months. I had not expected the way the world compressed to a single sound, the low, collective intake of breath when something beloved is suddenly broken. If this kind of story matters to you, stories about faith, people, and the strange ways we hurt and heal, subscribe and stay with me. This is the beginning of what I can only call my reckoning. I was born into a house that smelled of polished wood and willful silence. My family name opened doors in towns like ours, the kind that gather like magnets to the corners of the world where money quietly organizes everything. My childhood was not cruel, it was precise. I learned to be small in public so the family would always look large. My father, when he died, left a ledger of debts and a company that should have thrived but collapsed under a tide of mismanagement. Our wealth thinned, my status shrank on paper, then in the town. There were whispers, then fewer invitations. The charity galas I once attended as a child became reports of a past life. Loss does strange things. It carved me open and let questions walk in that I did not know how to answer. Ideology is a shelter for those whose foundations are shaking. I didn't notice how it started, how one taped-together leaflet at the cafe led me insidiously into rooms where certainty sounded like comfort. A leader found me in those rooms. He was a man who spoke like he held an exact map for every unspoken wound. And when my anger found direction, it felt like power. His name was Jonah Mercer. He was neither a priest nor a politician. He moved between both identities with the ease of someone who needed to be believed. Jonah didn't ask me to stop thinking. He offered me a simpler way to interpret my questions. If everything I had been taught to respect seemed to protect the unjust, then those things needed to be dismantled. He taught us to see symbols as props of a system, images that soothed people into acceptance. He taught us to break the props. For months, we gathered in basements and garages, in quiet corners of churches that would let us meet after hours, in living rooms where coffee cooled on laps. Jonah's words were easy to swallow. He told us stories about hypocrisy framed against purity, about how an image can be a monument to disregard. And when he named the statue in the square as an emblem of what needed to go, his voice sounded like a plan. I remember the slow accumulation of tiny betrayals, the dismissal from staff who used to smile at me in a way that felt like distance, the community meetings where my family's decisions were condemned without the nuance I knew lived in our mistakes. I wanted to be seen as more than my inheritance and less than my guilt. I wanted to be clean of the things I felt guilty for. Jonah told me breaking the image would be a kind of radical honesty, an act that exposed truth by removing false comfort. In the end, it wasn't revolutionary fervor alone that took me to the square. It was a raw, private ledger of grievances and the sugar-coating of confession. My hands held the sledgehammer because I believed that if I performed the ritual justly, my inner chaos might reorder into something simpler. I was wrong. Anger without direction finds itself out of breath. The night I broke was cold enough that my breath fogged in front of my face and condensed into small, private clouds. I had rehearsed the swing in my head so many times that muscle memory should have been a comfort. The first hit felt like a release, a chord struck at the center of a long, taut nerve. The hammer made a sound that opened a space inside me I mistook for relief. The second hit opened another layer, and I thought I'd be cleansed by the sound of stone succumbing. But the more I struck, the more the act felt like carving away at an absence. Not the absence of the statue's authority, but the absence of myself in the world. When the head broke free and clattered to the cobbles, the sound ricocheted through the square and woke a man who had been rounding the corner on his nightly rounds. Ben had been sweeping the chapel steps, humming under his breath. He saw the falling bronze and saw me in the half-light, and for a moment movement stilled in the world around us. He could have shouted. He could have lunged, phone already in hand. Instead, he crossed himself slowly and walked toward the chapel doors, keeping his eye on me like someone marking a storm as it passed. Afterward, people would fill in Ben's silence with explanations. Some would say he recognized me and felt pity. Others would claim he understood the law and knew a public arrest could inflame things. He told no one at the time. That small, private decision, his prayer, brief and wordless, pulled at the seam of the night in ways none of us had predicted. I ran. I shouldn't have run, but running is reflexive. It feels like an attempt to outrun consequence. I smelled of dust and metal and something deeper, like the off note of grief. In the alleys behind the square, I wiped my face with my sleeve and heard the distant noise of someone shouting, the first rough conversation become a public story. My phone buzzed, an anonymous message with a clip of me in motion. Within minutes, it was everywhere. By dawn, the square was a press conference of grief. The mayor arrived, face pinched as if trying too hard to be concise. The priest, Father Anthony Silva, stood before microphones and said words that would be pardoned if they weren't also the first public step toward consolation. We weep for what was lost. A pastor from the other side of town, Pastor Marcus Oliveira, urged calm. People gathered like flocks, some trembling with righteous rage, others clutching rosaries and scarves like armor. In between stood the cameras and the streaming feeds, digital gutters that do not soften edges. And then, something unaccountable happened. Water came out of the pedestal. It did not arrive like water gushing from a pipe, a man-made fluidity designed to bend to human logic. It seeped, at first, a few small beads that threaded along a hairline crack. Someone near the back, an elderly woman with a face like a well-loved hymn book, leaned forward and touched one droplet and gasped. A kid in the crowd shouted, perhaps because we had become a crowd willing to shout for the unexpected, and more people moved closer. The damp widened. Within minutes, a thin, steady flow of water traced an arc from the broken stone, pooling at the base of the pedestal and trickling into the drain. Phones were lifted. Comments blossomed in real time. Was it a prank, a pipe, a miracle? Theologies formed and unformed at the same breath. Some reached for words like grace or sign. Others, who had hated the statue for months, said nothing. I remember the sensation of being small in the center of a story that had become larger than my intention. Ben, who had watched me strike and then returned to his corner of the chapel, walked back toward the square after the first murmurs about water. He knelt and cupped his hands under the thin stream. He did not weep theatrically. His expression was quiet, like someone reading a page that he had not expected to find in a book he thought he knew. He pressed his palms to his lips and, with a voice thin from years of prayer, said, "Lord, let us be wise." Within hours, the phone lines of the local clinic were full. People with minor ailments came to taste the water and left shaking their heads, some wiping eyes dry with the backs of their hands. A woman named Maria, the baker who owned the shop 2 doors down from the square, posted a shaky video of herself saying that the joint pain that had made kneeling impossible for a year felt easier for the first time in months. A nurse scanned a handwritten note, "Feels less pain today," and uploaded it as an image. The images multiplied like a contagion of wonder. I watched the clips in a cheap motel room outside town, the sledgehammer still sticky in my memory. I wanted to write these things off as a mass of desperate meaning-making. I wanted to tell myself that a human desire for signs would shape any random occurrence into a story. But the more footage I saw, the harder it was to ignore that the phenomenon refused simple explanation. The town called for scientists. The university in the next city sent Dr. Carla Medina, a hydrogeologist with a steady face and a voice that carried the compact confidence of someone who had learned to say, "We do not know," without shame. She arrived with a small team, instruments that blinked and whirred, and a notebook in which the first line she wrote was a reminder: check for man-made sources first. "Testing, doctor." Medina explained to the watching crowd that afternoon showed no evidence of a pipe, no recent construction that could have connected to an underground supply, and no plausible source of groundwater that would surface exactly at the base of a man-made pedestal in a dry season. Her instruments recorded moisture. Her samples were water with chemical signatures consistent with natural sources, but not tied to known subterranean channels beneath the square. She collected samples and sent them to a regional lab. "We're not declaring anything supernatural," she said into a microphone as camera lights blinked like small suns. "We're documenting an anomaly." Journalists love anomalies. They make for tidy narratives that hint at the edges of the inexplicable without having to commit to certainty. The feeds surged. Opinion pieces divided the town into camps before anyone had time to be tired. Some people saw in the water a rebuke of my actions, a sign that the town had been tended by something beyond me. Others saw it as an opportunity to heal, a language with which the community could speak to itself after trauma. I listened to these voices from hotel television and anonymous comment threads, and the thing inside me that had felt empty at the pedestal began to twist into a different shape. Shame. Shame is not a quiet teacher. It grows teeth and insists on being recognized. I could no longer summon the arrogance that had made the night feel righteous. My chest tightened as if an unseen hand had closed on it. I found myself replaying Ben's bowed head and hearing Jonah's voice from the meetings, still slick with conviction, telling us that destruction was a kind of honesty. I now wondered whether destroying a thing could ever be honest if it only erased other people's stories. That night, I could not sleep. I walked to the motel bathroom and turned on the faucet, watched the water emerge in a steady human rhythm, and thought of the pedestal in the square. I put the back of my wrist to my mouth and tasted the cheap hotel chlorination and realized how hungry I was for a different kind of absolution. I pressed my forehead to the cool tile and said out loud, "God, if you listen, make me face what I did." The next morning I called my brother, Raphael, because calling him felt like tethering. He had been the one to stand near our father's hospital bed the week he died, and he had the ordinary, infuriating habit of not letting me be reckless in private. His voice when he answered was tired. "They want you to turn yourself in," he said immediately, not asking for my version. "There are cameras, the square is full, they're looking for someone to blame." There was a softness under his words, like the small, weary kindness that had kept him awake during our father's long nights. "I didn't mean to," I started, but the sentence was all jagged edges. How do you tell a sibling that you believed smashing a thing could make sense of a life? How do you explain the precise calculus of anger? "You have to stop running," Raphael said. "You have to answer. This is bigger than you think." In the end, it wasn't public pressure or the fear of jail that pushed me toward the police station. It was Ben. I kept seeing him kneeling by the pedestal, water on his hands, saying, "Let us be wise." There was something in his gentle restraint that made the insides of me ache. He had not hurled me to the ground or cursed the act. He had chosen prayer, and I found that his restraint complicated the pictures I had drawn of myself. If Ben could hold himself before God and hold himself from punishing me, then maybe the act I committed needed more than the blunt instrument of punishment to be answered properly. I took the long way into town, because a long way is a way to think. The streets were jammed with curious people, with those who had come for hope and those who had come for spectacle. A woman stopped me on the sidewalk and asked if I had done it. I didn't answer. People looked at me with fresh classification, the Heiress who had broken a thing. Teenagers pulled faces at me. An older man spit at my shoes. My breath became shallow and quick, the body's instinctive alarm system. I stood on the courthouse steps and watched a small boy offer his hand to his grandmother, who had been leaning heavily on a cane. He had come to show her the water. She couldn't make sense of the fuss. Their lives were not metaphors for my bad choices, and yet I had made their mourning a headline. It propelled me forward. Turning myself in felt like stepping into deep water for the first time. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the police precinct and walked toward the desk. A uniformed officer looked up, the kind of neutral face trained to process the human chaos that walks across it daily. I opened my mouth to speak, to say the words that would for once be honest in their gawky truth. I did it. When I said it, the room rearranged itself in a way I had never wanted but always feared. The murmurs, the sudden scribbling of notes, the tilt of the man behind the desk, as if the world had become a bell that needed to be rung. But even then, before anything official was recorded, my phone buzzed with a message from someone I didn't expect. Father Anthony. He had been to the square that morning. His message was short. "I can be there. If you want to talk before they bring you in, I will sit with you." There are moments that feel like hinge points, not because the world will immediately tilt in a new direction, but because the hinge promises a choice. Standing in that linoleum-floored station, surrounded by the ordinary smells of bureaucracy, I felt the hinge. I could close my mouth and fight. I could insist on a lawyer and a dramatic defense. Or I could let the story move through me and accept that the world had the right to ask hard questions. I said yes to Father Anthony. I asked for a priest because I needed someone who could sit with the parts of me that late-night meetings and rhetorical certainty had not touched. He was not the kind of priest you see in televangelist preachers, nor the cleric who laces his words with fire. Father Anthony came like cool water, steady, not surprised, neither indulgent nor condemning. He listened to my confession without flinching. When I told him about the hammer, about the emptiness, about Jonah's sermons and my better instincts that had alternately whispered and pleaded, he did not offer me platitudes. He asked questions with the patience of someone who had learned to let shame be spoken into life rather than swatted away. "You hurt a symbol because you hurt," he said quietly when I had finished. "Symbols gather people. They hold stories. Breaking one doesn't erase those stories." His words landed like small stones in a pond. It was not his intention to wound. It was his mission to name the truth. To hear it spoken soft as confession and not as headline was disarming. I left the station knowing they would write my name in reports and file papers, but the weight I had carried had shifted. It was not cured. It was shifted towards something that asked for repair. Outside the courthouse, the square hummed with conversation. The water still ran from the pedestal. People knelt. Some held photographs to the stream. A man who had been an opponent of my family shook his head and said, "I don't understand this water, but I can't pretend we don't need to talk." There was a meeting called for that evening at the chapel. The mayor asked for leaders to come together. Father Anthony, Pastor Marcus, and an interfaith representative from the local mosque, an imam who wore his certainty like a worn jacket. An invitation was sent to Jonah. He declined. The town wanted a conversation that could give the frenzy shape and perhaps prevent it from calcifying into violence. That night, in a room smell of candle wax and old hymn books, people came with exhausted faces. There were tears, blunt accusations, and moments of silence that felt like the space between heartbeats. Ben sat in the front row with his hands folded. He told the room why he had prayed that night instead of calling the police. I hoped for a way to make things right without more breaking. His voice was small but steady. The room listened because someone older than the shouting had told them a simple human thing. We only get one another for repair. Not everyone came to hear a sermon. Some came to demand accountability. Mother spoke of the children who attended the catechism classes under the statue. Shop owners argued the loss of tourism and history. It was messy and human in a way that historical narratives usually try to compress into tidy morality plays. We agreed, reluctantly and with varying motives, to 3 things that night. First, we would not answer violence with violence. Second, the town would request a formal investigation into the water and the structure. And third, the council would open a public forum for anyone who wanted to describe what the statue had meant to them. Whoever thought a thing symbolized everything for everyone had never lived through a town whose memories collided. In that forum, people told stories. Teresa, a woman who ran the laundromat on Maple Street, recited how her mother had rested a trembling hand on the statue's bronze foot after her husband left. A teenager named Miguel, who rarely spoke in public, said that the statue had been a landmark for his first kiss. The stories were not always pious, Sometimes they were ordinary and messy and stubbornly human. It dawned on me that the thing I had destroyed had been a repository of 1,000 quiet hopes and small rituals. In my attempt to demolish what I thought was false comfort, I had erased more than a symbol. I had disrupted 1,000 private languages. There was a point in the meeting where someone stood and said quietly, "Let us not do what the statue would not do. Let us not harden." It was said without theatrics, and it landed like Ben's prayer. I thought then about how easy it is to break and how hard it is to stay with the labor of repair. In the days that followed, Dr. Carla Medina's team returned with more instruments, and the lab called in more specialists. They put sensors into the pedestal and carried out tests that they described with careful terms in press releases. Pipes were ruled out. Seasonal runoff was unlikely. No tampering with utility lines was detected. The samples were clean water, indistinct and common in their chemistry, and yet their source was not easily accounted for. The lab's report would later be summarized in careful paragraphs. Anomalous outflow observed from pedestal. No man-made source detected. Further study recommended. For many, that sentence was an invitation to faith. For others, it became a test of whether the world still had corners that refused explanation. Word of the water drew people from outside the town, pilgrims and curiosity seekers who wanted to touch what they could not otherwise name. The square became a site where faiths brushed shoulders. A woman who called herself an atheist came and tasted the water out of sheer fascination, and wrote later in a blog that the day had felt like being inside an unanswered question. The imam offered a prayer beside Father Anthony under an umbrella. Pastor Marcus stood a step back and watched, his face open to something that resembled hope. Meanwhile, my online feeds threaded the whole scene with opinionated suppositions. Jonah's followers doubled down. He posted a sermon that condemned the town for sentimental attachment, calling the water a symbolic distraction. I watched his video and felt bile rise like the soft burn of a fever. He had not been present at any of the talks. He had not sat with someone who had lost a ritual. He wanted absolutes, and absolutes were the bottles we had broken, convenient and hard. At home, back in a small apartment I could still afford, though not the one of my childhood, I washed my hands and found they trembled. I placed them under tap water and felt a private relief. Then I scrolled through messages, the town's petitions, the viral clips, the people who had thanked me for setting a thing right, and the ones who wanted my head. The chorus of voices made it difficult to be a single person with a single heart. The world wanted either justice or vengeance, and people who built movements out of either rarely allowed for messier solutions. I began to sleep less and listen more. I started going to the square at odd hours, not to inspect the damage, but to watch the way people leaned toward one another there. I watched teenagers sit on the low wall and play cards near the trickle of water. I watched Ben sweep the chapel steps, an unremarkable act that I realized had weight because he never sought credit for it. Once, as dusk sank, I saw a woman kneel, cup her hands under the stream, and cry. I did not approach her. There was a dignity to the private things people did under the veil of the public spectacle. The podcasts started in the background of my life. People debated whether the water was evidence of the sacred or an instance of mass psychology. Epidemiologists and theologians took to microphones. A pastor on a national feed said, "We must be cautious," and meant it as a warning not to romanticize. A fringe commentator offered conspiracies. In the swirl, the very human claims, Maria's note about pain, the nurse's scanned note, took on lives they did not ask for. I read them and felt my past scrape against my present, and slowly, like the pressure of a steady tide, the town began to ask itself tougher questions than, "Who did this?" It began to ask, "How do we make things whole again?" My surrender had been a small beginning. Papers were filed. Jonah's rhetoric continued to thread through smaller groups who refused to engage in dialogue. But at the public forum and in the lines of patients who came to the clinic to ask about the water, there was a different energy. The uneasy muscle of repair preparing for movement. People who had been strangers before were now telling each other stories. They were, awkwardly, starting to convene. And for the first time since my father's death and the slow erasure of my place in town, I felt something that was not an urgency for destruction, but an appetite for something harder, reconciliation. It did not feel noble, it felt like work, old-fashioned and dull, and all the more honest for being so. There is a moment I return to in my head repeatedly. Ben kneeling at the pedestal, water filling his cupped hands. He looked up at me once, only for a second, and his face had an openness I could not earn and did not deserve. What he offered without taking was a path I had not known existed, a path that asked for labor, not performance. I wrote Jonah one last time after that evening's meeting. I did not ask for absolution. I asked for an end to the division he had sown between truth-seeking and cruelty. He did not answer. He never did. His silence was a kind of permission for his followers to harden further. With or without Jonah's voice, the town was changing. The water, whatever it was, had become a magnet for something other than curiosity. It became, in a way, a test. Would people choose to use this oddity as a wedge, or would they find in it an excuse to gather and discuss the hard work of repair? I don't have tidy answers. I have only the messy facts. The statue lay in pieces. The pedestal leaked water with no clear origin. Testimony began to swirl about relief and healing, and experts said only that the phenomenon was anomalous. In the middle of all this stood the choice that felt more dangerous than picking up a hammer: to engage in the slow, imprecise labor of restoration rather than the quick, intoxicating drama of destruction. The next morning, before anything official was announced, I sat across from Ben in a small side room of the chapel. He had poured me tea from a chipped pot and watched me with the plain patience of someone who had lived long enough to see families break and try again. "Why did you pray instead of calling?" I asked him, finally placing the question I'd had since the first night. He folded his hands around the mug as if pressing them to a hymn. "Because I did not know what you had been carrying," he said, "and because I wasn't sure that calling the police would make things better. Sometimes the world needs time to decide whether to break us or to let us mend. I hoped for mending." His words were both aggravatingly simple and nearly unbearable. There was no moralistic finale wrapped in them, no clean absolution. There was only a human measure, someone choosing patience when the public appetite demanded spectacle. That afternoon, Dr. Medina sent a message through the police that she wanted access to the pedestal overnight for more monitoring. The request amplified the town's curiosity into an institutional response. She wanted to set up sensors and cameras to see if the water's flow correlated to any environmental triggers. Her methods were methodical and a little cold. She spoke of data, not destiny. But her presence mattered. It signaled that the anomaly had to contend with both faith and fact. I watched her team erect a ring of instruments around the square, little devices that beeped softly in the twilight, wires like quiet veins. The sensors made the pedestal look like an archaeological find under a scientist's lamp. People came and pressed their faces to the cordons. A few visited after hours with cups, trying to catch a gulp of the water like it was a relic of hope. I didn't tell the scientists anything about the night I destroyed the statue at first. Confessing to the researchers would have had the practical advantage of providing context, but I wanted to see if the phenomenon would stand in the light of investigation without my confession coloring the interpretation. It felt like a small, selfish experiment, Would an explanation be found in the neat, clean language of instruments? The instruments told part of the story, and nothing of the heart. There were numbers that puzzled, but nothing definitive. Dr. Medina's team published a preliminary note to the local paper that read like the careful steps of someone afraid of being co-opted by either faith or sensationalism. No engineered water source detected. Hydrological patterns do not account for surface flow at this pedestal under current monitoring. Further research committed. For those who wanted certainty, those words were maddening. For those who wanted a space to wonder, they were an invitation. At night, I walked home past the square and often found the pedestal lit by a lone lamplight, the water a thread of silver pouring into a metal grate. A few people would be there, one with a guitar, another reading from a small book, a pair of teenagers arguing quietly about nothing that would matter in a year. Once, I saw a woman gently place a photograph under the trickle and then tuck it into her coat. The scene was ordinary in a way that frightened me, life continuing in the midst of spectacle. I had expected the town to unite around punishment. I had not thought that it might seek restoration. I had not imagined that one man's prayer, Ben's silent, deliberate choice, not to call the police, would steer the narrative off the rails of vengeance and toward a different, far harder work. I had not yet been tried. I had not yet faced the formal mechanisms of justice. The courtroom, the judge, the public ledger. Those things would come later. For now, there were meetings and debates, and people who wanted to hear the stories tucked into the statue's old shadow. The question hung in the air with the damp smell of the plaza. What does it mean to repair what you have broken? Who gets to do the repairing? And is there any justice that does not chew and spit out those who do the repairing themselves? I would later learn of legal frameworks and restorative practices that could fit into answers for those questions. For now, I was simply a woman who had swung a sledgehammer and opened a town into a conversation that neither my hammers nor Jonah's sermons could control. The choice I made 2 nights after the break was not cinematic. It was a small, stubborn step. I walked back to the chapel where Ben was closing up and told him I wanted to help. I wanted to put my hands on the pieces and, if possible, help in whatever process the town decided. He looked at me without the heat of moral victory in his face, only the tired willingness of someone who had decided to be present. Repairs take time, he said. They also need honesty. I had honesty now in a way I had never expected to possess. It was awkward and dangerous. It required me to speak with people who had the right to hate me, to listen to stories that had nothing to do with my intent, and to slow down the gratification I had chased into the night with the sledgehammer. It meant I would have to confront Jonah and the network he'd built, and, perhaps more terrifying, to confront the parts of myself that had believed in the cleansing power of destruction. I left the chapel with a plan that felt more like a vow than a strategy. I would not let the story stop at a headline. I would be present in the slow, awkward work of putting things back together. I would learn how to listen. I would let reparations be seen, not only spoken. I had no experience in masonry, in community organizing, or in being publicly contrite, but I had a stubbornness that had once favored demolition. I redirected it toward construction. The formal steps of the legal process moved like weather, predictable in their cycles, indifferent to the small human storms beneath them. I was arraigned, fingerprints taken, and my name was printed in the required columns of the town's daily paper. The hearing schedule, the pre-trial motions, the mandatory counseling sessions. These bureaucratic rails both constrained me and offered a framework for the work I had vowed to do. My lawyer, a precise woman whose competence I respected, urged me to be cautious about public statements. I agreed. The work I needed to do was not performative. Still, the town had to see accountability. Before the trial, a series of community hearings convened by the municipal council allowed people to speak on the record about what they had lost and what they hoped for. Those hearings were raw and beautiful in a way I had not expected. They were the first real education I received about the statue's role in ordinary, private lives. An elderly couple described how every Sunday morning for decades, they would walk hand in hand to the square and pause at the statue to say a quiet benediction before going to breakfast. A young mother told us that her grandmother taught her to kiss the bronze ring at the base of the pedestal on the day a baby was baptized. It was not about theology, she said, but about an intergenerational thread of tenderness. The laundromat owner, Teresa, spoke about the statue as a place where the community left grief and gathered courage. These were not the grand public claims of faith. They were the small, stubborn acts that become the architecture of ordinary belonging. One afternoon, I asked to meet with a woman whose testimony had made an impression on me, Marisol, a nurse who had worked at the clinic for years. She had brought a stapled packet of patient notes to the council and, with trembling fingers, described how she had seen several patients report symptom relief after exposure to the water. She was careful, professional, insistently cautious. She did not claim miracles. "People told me what they felt," she said, "and I documented it." Her stack of notes was clinical: dates, times, descriptions of pain levels, observations of mood. Some showed measurable changes in self-reported pain scales. Others were subjective improvements in sleep or appetite. She had submitted her notes to Dr. Medina for inclusion in the investigation. "I don't know what it is," Marisol told me when we sat together at a worn table in the back of the clinic, "but I do know that the people who came felt something shift. They told me, and I wrote it down. That is what I can offer, a record that invites study." She did not look at me as the woman who had knocked the statue down. She looked at me as someone who had been part of the event that had changed her caseload. That separation between the act and the human consequences was something I needed desperately to hold. The pre-trial months were a strange school. I showed up for mandatory counseling, sitting under fluorescent lights, telling strangers about the things I had felt and the emptiness I had hoped to fill with noise. I attended a small restorative circle facilitated by a mediator the council contracted, a neutral woman who had worked on justice programs in other towns. The circle included 2 shop owners, the head of the catechism program, a young man who was a longtime volunteer with the church, and Ben. At first, the meetings were tense, each person bearing the weight of their own grievance or compassion. Then, slowly, stories started to unspool. I listened as a child from the youth choir described the day he learned to read music while sitting near the statue. I listened to a widow talk about how, on a hard afternoon, she had leaned against the pedestal and prayed and felt heard. Each account was a reminder that the object I had destroyed had been woven into countless threads of ordinary life. Ben's presence in those circles was not performative. He did not come to grandstand or to claim moral high ground. He came with the quiet steadiness of someone who understood how people fracture and how they sometimes get put back together. In a small, blunt moment, he said to me, "If you want to make amends, you must hear what has been lost, and you must be willing to be accountable for the labor of fixing it." The district attorney's office filed charges, a misdemeanor for vandalism of a public monument and a separate charge related to the unauthorized tampering of a historical site. Prosecutors argued that such acts required punishment to deter others and to acknowledge the community's material loss. The defense did not deny the act. Instead, my counsel prepared a contextual mitigation, a story of radicalization, of a charismatic leader who exploited vulnerability, of a personal history of loss and identity erosion. The defense's aim was not to excuse, but to help a judge see the person, not merely the act. A week before the trial, Dr. Carla Medina presented her preliminary findings at a public forum. She explained the methods in plain language: sensors, chemical analyses, and inspections of municipal infrastructure. "We found no engineered source for the water," she said. "The chemical composition aligns with typical shallow groundwater in the region, but there is no clear hydraulic pathway we can identify under current monitoring. In plain terms, there is water, and we cannot locate a conventional source at this time." She refused to make theological claims. "Our work documents anomalies," she told the room. "It doesn't claim meaning. That is for others to interpret." Her careful refusal to pronounce meaning created a vacuum that both journalist and believer hurried to fill. For some, the absence of a natural explanation was a beginning of wonder. For others, it was a lacuna to be filled with skepticism. In the courtroom, her testimony would be one of the central pieces the judge had to weigh. It would not, on its own, absolve or condemn, but it changed the tenor of the public discussion. Something was happening in the square that required attentiveness to both material facts and the human dramas swirling around them. The trial, when it came, felt like a ritual of civic life. The courthouse was packed in a way that made the air hot and metallic. People filled the gallery, supporters who shouted for mercy and critics who demanded accountability. Cameras waited outside. I remember the weight of Ben's eyes on me as I took the stand to speak. The prosecution called witnesses who testified to the economic and emotional harm the destruction had caused. A local craftsman discussed the time and cost required to recreate the statue's base. A history teacher talked about the cultural value of the monument. Their voices were not vengeful, they were practical, and their claims were grounded in the material realities the town would have to face. Dr. Medina testified with the calm clarity I had come to expect. She explained how the sensors had recorded moisture differentials and how the lab's tests returned a water sample with typical ionic composition. Under cross-examination, she held to the limits of her expertise. "Science can't declare purpose," she said. "We can only document correlation and absence of certain explanations." She did not say miracle. She did not deny that some witnesses had meaningful experiences. Her presence was a kind of interpretive hinge in the courtroom. Data without doctrine, invitation without claim. Ben took the stand as a witness for the defense, though not in a way that sought to exonerate me. He spoke as simply as he had in the chapel. He described the night he had seen me and why he had chosen to pray instead of calling the police. His testimony was not a plea for leniency. It was an appeal to the court's sense of community. "We are a town with a lot of ways to be wounded," he said. "Sometimes the first thing we need is not punishment, but a chance to repair. The legal system can give you a day in court. It can also facilitate a path forward that doesn't keep breaking people." There were also victims who spoke with quiet pain. A catechism teacher described the loss of the place where generations had marked rites of passage. A mother argued that the statue had been a place where she taught her children to be still. These testimonies balanced the practical with the spiritual. The courtroom's air held both hurt and a desire to envision something beyond punitive cycles. My own testimony was a hurricane of awkward truths. I talked about Jonah's meetings, about the sense of being hollowed by loss, about the moment I had got breaking the statue would fill something in me. I stumbled through words that had never been properly honest until they were spoken aloud. The shame, the addiction to rhetorical righteousness, the recognition that anger is often a map that leads to self-destruction. I did not offer platitudes. I tried to speak as plainly as possible. "I am sorry. I thought I could erase what I felt by destroying what you loved. I was wrong." The prosecutor argued that an act like mine required a consequence that matched public harm. "There were legal precedents," she said, "to ensure that the law protects communal spaces and shared heritage." But even she, in a line of questioning that surprised me with its humanity, asked whether restorative measures could be part of a sentence that both acknowledged harm and required repair. The judge, Marcia Tavares, listened with an even face. In her rulings and remarks, she demonstrated a judicial imagination that takes community into account, not only the letter of the law, but its social function. Her written opinion after the trial reflected this balance. She convicted me on the charges, but, in her discretion, crafted a sentence that combined accountability and repair. A period of custodial detention, mostly symbolic given time already spent in pretrial constraints, mandatory counseling and de-radicalization programs, a multi-year community service plan focused on restoration work, and a direct requirement that I join a supervised team to rebuild the statue's pedestal and help craft a new monument that would be the product of many hands and voices. The sentence was met with a chorus of responses. Some called it too lenient, others called it a meaningful alternative to simple retribution. The restorative plan, which the judge approved and the town council codified, required stakeholders, church leaders, civic groups, and ordinary citizens to form a committee to oversee the rebuilding and to ensure the work centered mutual consent, historical sensitivity, and inclusivity. Part of the plan required that members of the community who had been harmed be given roles in the design, and that I spend significant time doing the manual work of restoration under the supervision of trained masons. I remember the moment the judge read the sentence in the courtroom. When she spoke of repair and listening, I felt both the sting of a penalty and the odd relief of structure. The sentence did not erase what I had done, but it refused vengeance as the only public response. It placed responsibility squarely in my hands. The early days of the restoration program were humiliating and instructional. I learned how to mix mortar in exact proportions and how to chisel without cracking the stone I had left damaged. My hands, once manicured and uncalloused, acquired blisters and calluses, and with them a new vocabulary for physical patience. I worked under the guidance of Seu Benedito, a master mason who had enlisted to teach because he believed skill must be shared. He had no interest in moralizing, only in craftsmanship and a strict insistence on doing the job right. Work teaches humility, he told me on my first morning, hand extended not in forgiveness but in offer. Work asks you to do small, faithful things. At first, people in the square watched me with a mixture of scorn and curiosity. Some spat words at me when I first carried stones into the workshop. Others came only to make sure I wasn't shirking. But there were also people who chose to meet me in the dust of labor. Mothers who had told their stories in the hearings, a few teenagers who wanted to learn masonry as an apprenticeship, Ben, who brought tea and sat on a crate while I hauled stones. The work had an odd leveling effect. Muscles don't respect social status, and in the mortar's smell, people were simply co-workers. The committee set up weekly public forums where design proposals for the new monument were presented and debated. There was a conscious effort to move away from the notion of simply reconstituting what had been lost and toward creating something that embodied the town's plurality. Some suggested a simple recasting of the bronze. Others wanted a wholly new piece that incorporated symbols from different traditions, an engraved plaque with names of those who had contributed time, a reflective basin to collect rainwater that would be visible to all. There were heated arguments about iconography and theological propriety. There were also moments of surprising consensus. In one particularly memorable session, Pastor Marcus spoke about the theological importance of symbols, how they can be abused, but also how they can direct the heart toward goodness. Father Anthony offered that symbols are not ends in themselves, but places where memory and hope can meet. The Imam spoke about humility and the need to welcome plurality. Those three voices, in their different cadences, built a framework in which the new monument could be imagined, not as a model of ideological dominion, but as a communal threshold. While the physical rebuilding progressed, the phenomenon at the pedestal remained. Sensors recorded intermittent flows. Dr. Medina continued to publish updates with cautious language. Moisture levels fluctuated, correlations with rainfall were weak, and no engineered conduit had been found. Laboratory tests continued to return water composition consistent with shallow groundwater, but with no clear path for it to appear where it did. The ambiguity persisted, and the town lived with it. As reconstruction advanced, dozens of personal testimonies continued to surface. Maria, the baker, brought fresh loaves to the volunteer teams and told me, quietly, that since she had sipped the water, she could rest better at night. She didn't present it as proof. She held it like a private fact that had altered her perception. Teresa at the laundromat recounted that she had mustered a kindness that day she had otherwise expected to be sour. A man who had come to the square as a skeptic said he felt less anxious after sitting by the trickle of water for a while. For every story of relief, there were others who reported no change, who remained skeptical, or who were uncomfortable with the attention. The pattern was messy and human, as ordinary as any clinic's report. Dr. Medina's team cataloged these accounts as anecdotal data points. Interesting, worthy of study, but insufficient on their own. There were also documented instances that drew careful attention. The hospital's orthopedic department submitted notes on a patient with chronic knee pain who had reported a marked reduction in pain after a week of visiting the pedestal for short periods. Objective measures, range of motion tests, and analgesic usage logs showed modest improvement, though doctors stressed the complexity of attributing causation. A local pastor recorded a testimony of a woman who, after months of depression, reported a significant shift in mood after engaging with a group at the square that met to pray and talk. Mental health professionals warned against conflating correlation with causation. They also acknowledged that the community's gathering itself had therapeutic value. The scientists' careful language did not stop the spiritual conversations. Instead, it complicated them in a way that I found oddly hopeful. If no one could definitively claim what the water meant, then the town had to decide collectively how to live with the unknown. For some, that meant pilgrimage. For others, it meant civic dialogue. For many, it meant simply tending to neighbors. One of the most transformative moments for me came not from testimony or trial or scientific report, but from a small meeting arranged by the Restorative Committee, a conversation between me and several community members who had been most visibly harmed. They had a right to speak, and I had to listen. Among them was Rosa, the catechism teacher whose students had used the square as a learning place; Paulo, the barber, who had collected donations for the statue's upkeep for years; and Marisol, the nurse whose records had been cited in the hearings. We sat in a circle in the community center. For much of the first hour, the air was brittle. People spoke about anger, about the way my act had felt like an erasure. They had every right to say these things. I listened without defending. I tried to be honest in my responses, about the emptiness, about Jonah's rhetoric, about my bad decisions. Where I had once used words to justify, I now used them to account. At a certain moment, Rosa folded her hands and said, "You must do more than rebuild stone. You must help rebuild trust." It was not an impossible demand. It was precise and exacting. It required time, presence, and a patient willingness to be corrected. It required me to be smaller in public and larger in service. The committee decided that I would lead an educational program for youth, teaching skills like masonry and design, and hosting conversations about civic responsibility and the consequences of ideological manipulation. The program paired practical skill building with a module on media literacy and critical thinking. Jonah and rhetoric like his could not be undone by a single program. They required generational patience. But the idea was to equip younger people with tools to resist simplistic answers. Work on the monument continued through rain and sun. The new design incorporated a shallow basin to collect water, a low bench for reflection, and bronze panels engraved with phrases contributed by residents about memory and hope. The team I worked with included people who had once been among my fiercest critics, and people who had quietly supported the restorative process from the start. There were awkward conversations about iconography, about God's role in the public square, about whether a symbol belonged to any single faith tradition. We compromised in ways that sometimes stung, but the compromises were honest attempts to honor pluralities. Over months, as the new monument took shape, the water continued to appear intermittently at the old pedestal's base, and then, as construction finished, in the basin we had created intentionally. No one could say whether the relocation of the water was coincidence or providence. Dr. Medina adjusted her monitoring. The pattern remained elusive. Sometimes the flow was steady, other times it simply didn't appear. The town learned to carry the uncertainty like a weight one could choose to carry lightly or heavily. One afternoon, as I knelt among volunteers to set a bronze panel, an older man named Elias, who had been a critic, reached over and placed his hand on mine. He had been an early protester in the square, his voice loud at the meetings. Now he was quieter. "You are doing the work," he said simply. "That's what matters." It was not a forgiveness that washed everything away. It was an acknowledgement that labor counts, that visible commitment to repair can shift public sentiment. In practical terms, it meant fewer hostile comments and more offers to help. Several businesses donated materials. Students from the technical school volunteered their weekends. Church groups of different denominations took turns bringing lunches for the team. The Legal Oversight Committee checked in regularly to ensure that the terms of the restorative sentence were met. I attended de-radicalization sessions where counselors helped unpack the tactics used by leaders like Jonah. The sessions were painful. They required me to confront how easily my need for belonging had made me vulnerable to rhetoric that simplified my pain. There were exercises in recognizing manipulation and strategies for rebuilding a sense of self not dependent on destructive gestures. Jonah, predictably, did not fade quietly. He published polemics that called the reconstruction a capitulation to sentimentality. Some of his followers remained angry. There were a few tense moments in the square when heated words were nearly exchanged. But community leaders, Father Anthony, Pastor Marcus, and the Imam, had anticipated such moments and organized de-escalation teams. Their presence, a unified human shield of sorts, helped keep tempers from boiling into violence. It was a practical example of how interfaith and civic cooperation could help tamp down cycles of escalation. As the months turned into a year, the monument's bronze was polished and set. The basin filled when it chose to, at times producing a slow, delicate filament of water that collected like a private gift in the sun. People came to touch it. Some knelt. Some simply sat on the bench and let the presence of the thing, part art, part communal altar, anchor their day. The inscription included words contributed by many: for remembrance, for repair, for the hands that make us whole. It was intentionally non-doctrinal in tone, a civic space meant to hold a plurality of devotion and memory. My sentence technically lapsed into a longer period of supervised community service. I remained subject to counseling requirements and to public scrutiny. But life in the town recalibrated. The sensation of being fetishized by feeds and columns dulled to the everyday texture of neighborly interactions. People greeted me without the initial sharpness I had first encountered. Some still avoided me. That was fair. Trust, once broken, does not return on a schedule. It returned in increments. The phenomenon of water did not cease to be puzzling. Dr. Medina continued to publish updates that read like a scientist's diary. Recorded anomalies, a lack of engineered sources, a recommendation for longitudinal hydrological studies. Laboratory results occasionally registered minor variations in trace elements that were within the expected range for the region, but not easily explained by local surface hydrology. Science's posture of "we don't know yet" allowed people to live with a mystery without insisting it be proof of anything beyond the fact that it was an anomaly. The community, in turn, began to use the ambiguity as an impetus for dialogue. Meditation circles, interfaith vigils, and civic discussions were held in the square, sometimes centered around the monument, sometimes simply occupying the space as a reminder that the town's public life was, at its best, a work of constant negotiation and care. People from different traditions knelt by the basin in an unfamiliar but quiet solidarity. A local art teacher organized workshops where students contributed small tiles to a communal mosaic embedded in the base of the monument. Each tile bore a phrase or image chosen by the child, some theological, some simple, like Grandpa's laugh or first bike ride. There were quieter repairs too. I spent afternoons at the clinic helping organize visits for elderly residents who had difficulty getting around. I taught a weekly masonry class to teenagers through the town's apprenticeship program, and we eventually formed a youth group that helped maintain public spaces. The hands-on work taught me lessons you can't learn from moralizing: how the right curve in mortar lasts, how a good foundation resists weather, how words matter as much as tools when bridging differences. Civically, the town instituted a small grant program to maintain public monuments and to fund community-led restoration projects. The initiative had a practical logic: prevention through stewardship. It was born of the accident I caused and the collective desire that the future would involve fewer acts of destruction and more acts of maintenance. There were moments of deep, surprising tenderness. Once, in the square at dusk, I watched an elderly man come and place a small, yellowed photograph into the basin. He bowed his head for a moment, then left without fanfare. I realized then that the basin served as both a symbol and a functioning repository of private acts, people leaving an offering of memory to be touched by water. It felt like the town had found a way to make space for the small, ordinary rituals that had once been under the statue's shadow. The water continued to appear unpredictably. A visiting hydrologist from the state university suggested that the pedestal sat atop a pocket of shallow groundwater that responded in complex ways to atmospheric pressure and subterranean shifts. He proposed a multi-year study to map subsurface conditions. The town approved a modest budget. For some, the trouble of science mattered. For others, the ritual of the basin and the collective work of repair mattered more. I found myself drawn more and more to the quiet hour before dawn when the square slept and the basin sometimes whispered. I would cup my hands beneath the thin flow and watch the water break into my palms. The sensation was physical and simple. It did not end guilt or make me absolved. It anchored me in presentness. I could not say whether God had arranged the event, whether subterranean channels had their own logic, or whether the coincidence of a human brokenness and a natural anomaly had created a cultural flashpoint. What I could say with clarity was that the work of repair had altered me. I could feel my earlier hunger for dramatic gestures dissipate into a steady appetite for small, consistent labor. Months after the reconstruction was complete and the new monument formally unveiled in a modest ceremony, the restorative committee published a report summarizing outcomes: the reconstructed monument, the youth apprenticeship program, a record of service hours completed, and an evaluation of the town's responses to the phenomenon. It acknowledged that some questions remained unanswered. It recommended further study and more resources for community resilience programs. On the day of the unveiling, Father Anthony, Pastor Marcus, the imam, and a host of civic leaders stood together. Ben, looking older and less fragile than I had imagined, spoke about patience and the necessity of choosing mending over breaking. He did not lionize me. He did not forgive me in front of cameras with a speech meant to swell hashtags. He simply said, "We have chosen to do the hard thing, to repair." When the ribbon fell away and the monument stood whole, a crowd gathered. The basin caught a little light. The water, if it chose to appear that day, would give the scene an extra depth that reporters loved. People took photographs and then, for the most part, dispersed to their lives. The point had been made, and the work would continue quietly. As I stood at the periphery, a woman I had met in the forums, whose son had once used the statue as a meeting point, came and put her hand on my shoulder. "You showed up," she said. "That's more than most do." Her words were small and exacting. I accepted them. The phenomenon maintained its ambiguity. Scientists remained curious and careful. The town had built a civic infrastructure to respond to the odd without letting it become a wedge. The movement that Jonah had led did not vanish, but it lost momentum as the program's apprenticeship and de-radicalization offerings reached some of the people who were susceptible to his rhetoric. No total conversion occurred. People made their own choices. Some of Jonah's followers hardened and left town. Others drifted away. The truth was more mundane. The town shifted in its rhythms and priorities, not because of one stone or one stream, but because a group of people decided, despite pain, to invest in repair. As for me, my life narrowed to the daily practice of service. I worked on public projects, organized youth workshops, sat in counseling appointments, and attended meetings where decisions were made slowly and imperfectly. I repaired not only the monument, but my capacity to be in relationship without needing a platform. The public frenzy faded into a quieter, steadier sense of responsibility. On an ordinary afternoon, a year and a half after the night I swung the hammer, I was kneeling at the basin with a young apprentice, smoothing the edge of a tile she had made. The water trickled, thin as a whisper, and the sun made the metal gleam. The apprentice asked me, unexpectedly, why I had chosen to stay. I paused, felt the mortar in my palms, and answered honestly, because repair is harder than destruction, and because I needed to learn how to be present for people rather than erase them. I couldn't unmake what I'd done, but I could try to make something that might hold us better. She nodded in a way that suggested she understood beyond words. She dipped her fingers into the basin and let the water run over them. They came away smudged with a little bronze dust and a smear of mortar. I think now about the smallness of the daily things that changed me, the ache in my hands that made me humble, the awkward apologies that taught me the limits of words, the stories people shared that made abstract claims about symbols into personal narratives. Those were the elements of the town's healing. There was no final cinematic reveal. There was no divine pronouncement handed down from a cloud. There was the slow accretion of ordinary acts that together shifted the shape of public life. And yet, even in the ordinary, there was wonder. People who had been divided now met for coffee after church or for a quiet workday in the square. The basin continued to surprise. Dr. Medina published another study that invited a longer scientific inquiry. Medical notes continued to log patient reports with caution and humility. The phenomenon persisted as an open question, a focal point around which a community practiced its better selves. The last time I knelt at the basin in public, Ben was there sweeping the square. He glanced up and smiled without fuss. A child ran past with a kite, laughing. A man set down a wooden bench someone had donated. I cupped the water in my hands and felt a coolness that had no claim on me but gave me a living, tactile reminder that some things in the world are not for ownership. They are for tending. I have no illusions about neat endings. My record is public. There are still people who cannot abide my presence, and I accept that. Reparation is not a transaction. It is a long, mundane apprenticeship in humility and service. The legal sentence closed one chapter, but the work continues. Counseling, community oversight, and the daily practice of showing up. If there is a single lesson that has settled into me like a stone set into mortar, it is this. The impulse to destroy is often rooted in a hunger for control or meaning, and the only counterweight strong enough to redirect that hunger is consistent communal labor. The basin with its strange spring did not make my guilt vanish, nor did it absolve the town. What it did was provide a locus for attention, scientific curiosity on one side, private grief and shared rituals on the other. Together, they forced the town to reckon with how to respond to the unknown without collapsing into spectacle or suspicion. I cannot claim to have made things right, but I have learned to remain in the work of trying. I have learned that restoration asks for acts of humility, of learning a craft, of listening without defense, of repairing a public space alongside those you have wronged. I have learned that the presence of mystery does not license fanaticism, nor does an absence of explanation require cynicism. It requires a community willing to practice patience and to build frameworks for repair. Today, the square is quieter than it was at the first outbreak of frenzy. People pass through. They linger sometimes. They bring children, photographs, questions. The basin catches the light. The monument, when you look at it closely, bears the fingerprints of many hands, some steady, some clumsy, all human. I still think of Jonah sometimes, and of the seductive simplicity of his rhetoric. I do not believe in easy answers. The work of remaining human in the face of pain is painstaking and rarely glorious. But if there is grace to be found in public life, I have learned that it often appears in small measures. An offer of tea from a man who had once watched me break something, a neighbor who brings you lunch while you are setting tiles, a city's willingness to fund long-term study rather than rush to certainty. The town did not choose vengeance. It chose repair, not because deciding was easy, but because it was necessary. The sentence the judge handed down could have been a mere box to be checked. Instead, it became scaffolding for something far more demanding. A program that taught young people trade skills, invited critical thinking, and created spaces where the radicalizing tides could be noticed and countered before they became tidal waves. I still visit the basin in the quiet hour. I cup the water in my hands and I think of all the people whose small, ordinary lives had once made that statue matter. I think of Ben, who chose prayer over the ease of calling the police. Of Marisol, who documented what she saw without claiming miracles. Of Dr. Medina, who kept insisting that the investigation not be co-opted by wishful thinking. Of Father Anthony and Pastor Marcus and the Imam, who modeled how to hold different convictions without turning them into weapons. The phenomenon at the base of that old pedestal has not been explained. Scientists continue to study. The town continues to live. But the deeper movement, the one that matters to me, has been toward communal responsibility. The monument stands now as a reminder that what we break is often more than we ever meant it to be, and that what restores is not spectacle, but the hard, patient labor of making amends. If you have ever seen something you couldn't explain, or if you carry a regret that feels too big to name, share it. Tell someone. The work of repair depends on stories and on people who will listen without immediately leaning toward judgment. If this story reached you, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear that restoration is possible, even if it is slow and costly. I hit the statue at 3:47 a.m. I thought I was striking a lie. What I struck was an empty place in myself. The town, and not just the town, but the people in it, taught me how to begin to put those pieces back. The water continued to flow, in its own uncooperative way, and the work of repairing lives did what no single act of destruction could. It invited us into the slow work of becoming whole again.